So just to give you a quick idea of what we're going to be doing this morning, we have Elliott Cappell with us, the Chief Resilience Officer of the City of Toronto. He's going to be speaking to you in a few minutes. We'll provide an opportunity for you to talk to Elliott when he's after he's finished. We'll take a bit of a break, and then we'll have an exercise. We'll have some background from TD Insurance on the priority of these particular issues, particularly for many of you who work in or intend to work in the emergency response area. Many of the issues associated with climate impact are fairly profound. I know our colleagues at TD Insurance told us that the biggest event from their perspective in terms of claims in the last year wasn't actually water, and it wasn't fire, it was wind. And you may recall that incredible windstorm we had on the 5th of May. Just the devastating impact of trees hitting cars and houses and people and whatnot. So there's multiple aspects to this particular challenge. So perhaps without any further ado, I'm going to bring Elliott Cappell up. Elliott is going to give you a bit of background on who he is, what he does with the City of Toronto. It's, as we say, it's a 2-year initiative. He'll give you a bit of background on the work that they're doing in the City of Toronto to address many of these issues. So thank you.
Good morning. How's everybody doing? Thanks so much for having me at Seneca. Seneca's been such a great partner for me and for our program, for us. So it's a pleasure to be here. And thank you also to TD for sponsoring it. It would be really nice if you could go to Queen's Park with the same message. They keep telling us that they don't want to hear from bureaucrats. They want to hear from businesses. And yet they keep on saying things that don't make any sense about climate change. They are currently consulting on their climate change plans, so it'd be good if you could go and speak to them and speak a bit of sense into our politicians. Anyway, is this thing going to work? What's going to happen? Right. So I'm the Chief Resilience Officer, and the first question people ask is, what does that mean, right? So there are 100 cities in the world that are participating in the 100 Resilient Cities Network. And basically the idea is that, the cities that were created, Toronto was created, more than 150 years ago, wasn't really created to think about climate change, to think about globalization, think about migration, refugees, these kinds of large issues that are affecting cities today. And so the idea behind urban resilience is to take a 21st century approach to build the cities that we want for our future. And so before I get into kind of my presentation, I just want to warm up a little bit. So before I tell you what I think resilience is, I'm going to force you all to do a little bit of work, I know. So I want you to we're going to take like 2 minutes, okay? You're going to turn to the person beside you, or maybe 3 if there's only 3 of you at the table. And I want you to say, if you were writing Toronto's resilience story, however you define resilience, what would you put on Toronto's resilience story? Does that make sense? Can I get like everyone nodding if that makes sense? Yeah? Okay, so we'll just take 2 minutes, turn to the person beside you, or 3 or whatever, and let's discuss what is Toronto's resilience story. Okay, we're just going to take like 30 more seconds. Everyone finishing up. Anyone want to share an example of what they would have put on Toronto's resilience timeline? And if no one volunteers, I might have to volunteer. Anyone have a good example they want to share? Anyone? Okay, let's start in the back of the room then. How about from that table? Any examples? Yeah.
Probably alterations to like fire code and building code after disasters.
Okay, so fire students went to the fire disaster code. Anyone else from the back tables want to share something? Oh, yeah. Can you stand up? Sorry, we can't hear you. Okay, cool. Flooding? Yeah. Anyone? How about this table? No ideas? Sorry? The G20 summit. Yeah, that's a really good one, right? Not a natural disaster. So why did you put that one on there? Cool. Yeah. This table, everyone seems to be laughing. Someone's looking up the definition of resilience on their computer or something. How about over here, anybody? Anyone want to share? How about from the corporate guys in the corner? Anyone have a good one to share?
Well, we went through quite a bit. So we talked about Hurricane Hazel, which Bill was there.
I didn't cause it, but I was
There was a lot over here. So we talked about planning for large disasters, storms, which are increasing in frequency. We talked about collaboration with partners at TRCA. Start listening to what they're doing and their planning, and Fort Lake Center, people like that who are already mapping these things out. We talked about how the infrastructure. I just wrote down what you guys said. We talked about the infrastructure being too old and the density being too high.
Okay.
So I think we're living off our past and borrowing from our future instead of building.
Okay, so from the students in the room, who thinks that we're living off our past and borrowing from our future? Anyone? Anyone? I do. I haven't built a new subway in ages. Okay. So now I'm going to go into the part where I thank you everyone for sharing your ideas. I'm going to give you a bit of a longer definition of resilience, and then we can think maybe more about Toronto's timeline later. So this is how our office defines resilience. It's the ability to survive, adapt, or thrive in the face of any challenge. Okay, that's a pretty broad definition. So let's get a bit tighter for Toronto. And we look at it on sort of two areas. One is hotter, wetter, wilder, right? This is from Toronto's Future Climate Driver Study. This is what we think the climate's going to look like in 2040. It's going to be really hot. It's going to be really wet. But frankly, we don't need to look forward to 2020 or 2040 or 2080 to see climate change. We had the coldest January on record, right? It was cold in January. We had the longest heat wave in 30 years in July. We had a windstorm. We had an ice storm. We had flooding in August, a 1 in 100-year storm. We had a 1 in 100-year storm last year also. This graph shows that pink line is what we experienced, and the shaded line behind is what we should have experienced based on historical averages. So you see that 5%, basically every day was outside of the historical average, and 5% of a days last year broke some kind of climate record. So we don't need to project into 2040 like it's happening now. This is from last year. I was surprised that nobody actually brought this example up, but this is the water levels from the Port of Toronto last year, where we shattered the records for the lake level, right? The islands flooded, there was waterfront flooding, and this is primarily due to increased rainfall, right? Some of it due to urbanization, but mostly it's due to more rain than we should ever expect to have. So that's one way to look at things, is like, what are our big risks? What are the things that could happen to us? But there's another side to resilience, which is about our vulnerability, right? Because, if you are, if the power goes out for 3 days, those of us who have food, in the cupboard are fine. But if you're really relying on the food in your fridge and freezer to make you to the end of the week or to make you to the end of the month, then you experience that power failure really differently than I do. And so the second way that we think about things is vulnerability, right? And in Toronto, there's a reason we call this the neighborhoods analysis. Toronto is, one of the fastest growing cities in the world, definitely the fastest growing city of our kind in the world. Toronto's a really prosperous, great place, exhibited by campuses like these. This is a picture of Toronto's skyline 2005. This is 2016. Right? That is not happening anywhere else in the world like that. But I'm going to show you a bit more of a complicated. This is a map of the city of Toronto, so I think probably a lot of people here live outside the city borders, but in the region. So this is just the city. And what you see, the blue areas are areas of high income. The red are areas where the average income is low. And the dimensions of it, how high and how low, is how high the income is and how low it is. And what you see here is a pretty big gap between primarily inner suburban neighborhoods and downtown neighborhoods, primarily. And to me, this is as big a threat as climate change. Maybe it's a bigger threat than climate change. Because, again, I go back to the power failure example. You think about 650 Parliament, for example, right? That apartment building which burned down a little while ago, had a massive fire. I shouldn't say burned down. If you're living in a high-income neighborhood, you probably have the resources to buffer you from that kind of shock. And if you're living in a lower-income neighborhood, maybe less so. And we know from every example internationally, from New Orleans to Boston to Japan, lower-income neighborhoods as a whole do worse in shocks and recover more slowly. So it's really important for any resilience strategy to take into account the vulnerability of neighborhoods, not just the risks that might come. I'll give you another example. Basement flooding is something I think we're probably going to talk about more today, right? If you live in a basement, when I got my first job, I lived in a basement, right? I could barely make rent 1 month to the next. A lot of people in Toronto live in basements. Basement flooding affects those people, right? Because, yeah, the homeowner still gets to keep their home, but if your basement is flooded, you're out, right? You can't stay there. So we really have to think about the capacity that people have to withstand a shock, not just the shocks that we're going to experience. So this is just a graph showing those neighborhoods over time. And so those of us who lived in Toronto, you know, in the 80s will maybe remember Toronto as a middle-income city, where that yellow bar, middle income, was most neighborhoods. That's changed over time, where most of our census tracts are actually, by the national definition, low income. And this is a major threat to resilience. So when we think about resilience, we think about a wide range of challenges. We think about the climate challenges, flooding, blizzards, heat waves, power failures. How many people here live in an apartment building? I do. How many people live above the 4th floor of in an apartment building? Yeah, so when the power goes out, that's a real issue. First of all, because we can't get up and down the stairs easily. I mean, I can do it, but my father can't. And water doesn't pump any higher than that after the power goes out. So a prolonged power failure, again, a major issue. And then, you know, poverty, inequality, access to housing, aging infrastructure, and getting around. I experienced that this morning. Sorry for being late. So how did we get to those sorts of challenges? So don't concern yourself with the details here, not that you can read it, but our office is running about 15 projects looking at different aspects of resilience, from basement flooding to neighborhood level resilience. We engaged with 7,000 people in the last 18 months, some of it through community animators, so residents who are holding resilience conversations in their neighborhoods. We've got a website. If you're bored with my speech, you can look at it on your phone, resilienttoronto.ca. That's 2 T's, resilienttoronto.ca. We had a telephone town hall. We worked through libraries and a bunch of other means. We have 80 partners. This is a map that shows how our partners are connected. Seneca's on that map somewhere. And it's a range of people. It's businesses, it's academics, it's other governments. TRCA was mentioned. They're a close partner. So I just want to share with you from all that work, those 15 projects and 7,000 people, some of what we heard when I asked a similar question today. And what's surprising to me is that when we ask people about the resilience challenges, you'll see here that the number one thing is heat waves, probably because we asked this question in the middle of a heat wave. But the number 2 question that people responded was getting around. That actually their biggest resilience challenge is that they spend 2.5 hours a day on the TTC. And I thought that was a really interesting way of thinking about, you know, your day-to-day resilience. And then when we ask people also to think about what trends are happening in their neighborhoods, like if they looked in the future, you know, we're developing a resilience strategy, so what should we address in the future? The first 2 things people said were getting around and access to housing. And the third thing people said was affordability, which I think is really fundamentally linked to housing. So I show you these slides just to make the point that, you know, different people understand resilience in different ways. And, you know, I think that we really have to take into account climate change, but we also need to think about, you know, how people live and how people get around, because fundamentally that impacts how you would withstand a climate shock. We also asked people to describe what they thought the current state of resilience in the city would be and what their desired future state of resilience in the city would be. And what's interesting is that the number 1 word that we heard in both places was diversity, or diverse, or something along those sorts of lines. Equity was listed number 2 in the future state. And, you know, I think that's a really important perspective, because it's really the thing that Toronto has that other cities don't have, right? Toronto's the most diverse city in the world. More than half our population was born outside of Canada. more than half our population identifies as a visible minority, but what are we doing with it, right? We know that about biodiversity makes ecology more resilient. We know that a diverse economy makes an economy more resilient. We have a really diverse population here, but frankly, we just had a municipal election on Monday, and does that council look like the population in Toronto, right? When we look at our business leaders, do we look like the population in Toronto? Are we drawing on our diverse population to make the most of all the cultures that we have here? Are we drawing on our diverse population for market diversification? So I think we have to ask ourselves, you know, if we all agree that diversity is our strength and diversity is something that can make us more resilient, you know, what are we doing specifically to leverage that strength? And so one of the examples I want to give, actually before I give this example, any questions partway through? Save them to the end? We'll save them to the end. I'm going to give you an example of one of the projects we're working on. We're working on about 15 projects. I've chosen not to give the basement flooding example because I think probably other people are going to talk about it. And I want to talk about a project called Resilient Towers. So just one more time, how many people here live in an apartment building here? Is that really everybody? Okay. So in the city of Toronto, we have 1,189 apartment buildings that are taller than 8 stories, and 880 of them are private sector owned. In those 880 buildings, we have 500,000 Torontonians living in buildings that are more than 35 years old. So if you drove north here today, or you took the bus north here today, like along Bayview or the DVP, you can see older apartment towers pretty much everywhere. And those were mostly built in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And some of them are in really good condition. Some of them are kept up really well. And unfortunately, the majority of the stock is not in good condition. And you know, we think this is a major issue for resilience for a lot of reasons. First of all, power failures are a big resilience risk, right? And a lot of these buildings are not just taller than 8 stories, but they're 20 stories, they're 30 stories, they're 40 stories. They are big emitters. Buildings are the biggest emitters of pollution in the city of Toronto. They really, where you live really impacts your outcomes in a resilient shock, right? Some of the shocks that were mentioned, like windstorm, or flooding, or heat wave. If you live on the top floor of an apartment building during a heat wave, it's going to be really hot. And we saw that in Montreal this year, that most of the deaths that happened in Quebec during the heat wave were from people who were living on the top floor of buildings. And I think there's also a real opportunity here. You know, we hear governments talk about shifting to the green economy. Well, that looks like, you know, jobs in local places retrofitting buildings. So basically the purpose of this project that we're doing is we're trying to change the incentives for building owners to make investments in their buildings. Because right now a lot of the building stock is not in good repair, and we want people to make investments in the best technology, right, the best standard of living for those 500,000 Torontonians. So, you know, why is this a big challenge? Well, we have about 1,200 towers in Toronto. 880 of them are owned by the private sector. And so if we wanted to make an improvement in those towers for everybody who lives in a tower in the next 20 years, which is actually a pretty long timeline, we'd have to retrofit 30 to 50 buildings a year. So if we want to get there, if we agree that housing is really important, we agree that the 500,000 people who live in the towers are important, and we agree that climate change is a big risk for those people, then we need to take some real action, really sharpen our minds, because 30 to 50 retrofits a year is a large number. Can anyone guess how many retrofits we've done in the last 10 years? Nope, it's an easy number to remember. Yeah, we've done 0. We've done none. And so the work that we're doing is to study, you know, why haven't we done any? And basically what we've come to is that it's really expensive, and it doesn't make financial sense for the building owners to do the retrofits. So we're looking at economic tools like tax changes and other policy changes, zoning, that would change those financial incentives. So this is an example of a project we're working on that we think will have a really big benefit for climate resilience. It'll make people more resilient to heat waves, to flooding, to cold snaps. It'll decrease emissions, but it'll also address that vulnerability side, that social and economic vulnerability that I spoke about a bit earlier. So what are we doing next? So in mid-November, November 21st, we're going to be doing some public workshops where we're going to release our draft resilience strategy that will say, like, here's what we think Toronto's resilience story is. Here are our policy recommendations to survive, adapt, and thrive. And then in early 2019, those will go to the powers that be on Toronto City Council. And then hopefully by mid-2019, we'll have a strategy which is approved and in action addressing Toronto's resilience challenges. If you want to participate in any of this, just go to our website. You can do it on your phone or on your computer, resilienttoronto.ca. That's 2 T's again. You can fill out a survey. You can learn more about us. You can follow us on Twitter. You can follow us on Instagram or Facebook. And you'll get all the information that way and have a chance to provide your feedback. So that's the end of my presentation, and I just opened it up if you have any questions.
So, I'm trying to speak loudly. Fantastic initiative. I'm interested to know who your partners are and how you communicate with them in the private sector and other institutional sectors.
Okay.
So the very humble and weak-voiced Glenn Miller wants to know who the partners are and how you get them to work with you in the public sector.
So I think, from our perspective, the most important thing is making what we call a really wide tent, right? In the past, government, so I'll just give you a little story. So City Hall, for those of you who don't know it, is these 2 kind of weird-looking towers. And on one side, on the inside, facing in, there are windows. And on the outside, facing out, there are no windows. Does anyone know why? Yeah, Bunny Architects. So the idea of the design of the building was that the city staff should be looking in towards where City Council sits to follow direction from Council and shouldn't be looking out. I think that's wrong, right? I think the most important thing for city government is to be out in the community, to be as close to people as possible, and to partner as much with the private sector, because something like the Resilient Towers Initiative, we don't have the money to do it, and we're also not as good at risk, and we're not as good at innovation as the private sector. So it's really fundamentally important to partner with those groups. So I would say we have, I'll say at least 5 different types of partners. We have community partners. So we're working with 10 resilience hubs around the city, ranging from East Scarborough Storefront to the Rexdale Community Health Center. We're working with the private sector. A lot of that's through the insurance industry, Insurance Bureau of Canada, the Intact sector. We're working with the universities. So U of T, Ryerson, and others, and of course colleges also, including Seneca. We're working with other governments. We are working with the federal government and provincial government and TRCA. And then lastly, we're working with other cities. So we've worked really closely with New York, Montreal, Rotterdam, Los Angeles, Sydney, really a global network of cities from which we can learn. Obviously, like, Rotterdam, we can learn a bit about flooding from them. And LA, we can learn a little bit of heat. And so it's a really nice network for sharing. Does that answer your question?
Talk to us about, because we have...
We've got one question over here, sorry.
Sure, but as I move over there, we got a lot of folks here that are in emergency service or fire protection areas or planning for the future in some of those emergency areas. What are some of the tools that they need, given that fire was a kind of a driver of 19th century initiatives that led to the infrastructure we have around fire now? We have a much broader emergency service need now. You mentioned, people on the top of buildings, the potential for water inundation, wind, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What are some of the skills and talents and things that they need to know to be able to kind of work in the future in some of these areas?
So I don't have an emergency services background, so I'm going to now tell you what I think you should do, even though I'm not a professional in it. So I think you should probably listen to the professionals. But from the work that we've seen around the world, the most important thing, or like say the cutting edge theory practice, is that when there's a large scale emergency in Toronto, and I'm going to say when, not if, because we're not special. Well, we are special, but we're still a city, and it's happened in every city in the world. There aren't going to be enough first responders. There aren't going to be enough VIEW people to serve the entire region, right? There's just not going to be enough. And so our number one first line of defense in any big shock is a strong community. And, we see that from international evidence, everywhere around the world that, from New York to Victoria State in Australia or New Zealand, in Wellington, that the leading emergency services are really getting very close to community. And they're building that missing link between the fire chief and the head of social development. Because at the end of the day, you look at something again like 650 Parliament, 1,500 people, right, out on the street. The city can't house them. We house them for some time in a community center or in hotel rooms at a significant cost. At the end of the day, we have 1,500 people who are out of their apartments for 6 to 9 months. They need somewhere to go, and the best thing that we can do is find appropriate housing for them in the communities where they live. Moving people from 650 Parliament to temporary accommodation in Brampton for 9 months, is going to have a drastic impact on their lives, on their livelihoods, on their kids' education, on their mental health. So, I just go back to this point that I think community development is fundamentally important. You can protect yourselves from risks as much as possible, but at the end of the day, your underlying vulnerabilities are a major determining factor in how you fare in a shock and how you bounce back. So, to my opinion, for all of you future emergency managers, I think the most important thing that you can do is get out in the community, understand the communities that you work in, try to understand the languages and the messages that resonate and travel in those communities.
Hi. So I just had a quick question. So you described resilience as the ability to survive, adapt, and thrive in the future. So my question is, because I work in the insurance industry myself, so I noticed on May 4 and September 21 with the windstorms, there was a lot of power outages. And then you showed us a diagram here of how the demographic now is moving more towards the low income. My question is, what do you do for those people who don't have, for example, tenant insurance and the power goes out and maybe they have to throw out their food? They might not be able to retain that, that exposure themselves. What's the city's role in that aspect?
I mean, I think that's a really good question. First, I'll just give you, so the short answer is I don't know. We don't have the answers, but it's a really, really important point. And I think that it's sort of like, it's really fundamental to addressing, as I said, the first line of defense is a strong community. And I think what that means is having community structures that are set up. Unfortunately, that means sometimes food banks, right, set up. I think it means us providing the right information to homeowners and the right support to homeowners. I think you're going to hear from Blair Feltmate later today, whose group has designed the Home Flood Protection Program. And, we're talking about pretty simple stuff that people can do around their houses with, a couple $100 to basically save their house from disaster, to put it simply. So I think it's about, helping homeowners get the tools as much as possible. And I think it's about helping businesses also have the tools. So in terms of your specific example, how do you get people to take up insurance products that are ultimately going to be good for them in resilience? I don't know. I think that's a question more for the insurance sector professionals in the room. But I think it comes back to the point that really we need to change the mindset in the city. We need to be a bit more ready, a bit more prepared, and that starts in people's homes, in their apartments, in their businesses, in their communities.
And I think the likelihood is that the majority of people in this room, if they're going to be working in Toronto or environs, they're going to be living in an apartment. It could be a condominium, whatever, but that's the future living for the majority of people that are in this room right now. I
mean, the future, it's now. That's now. Yeah. I mean, maybe less so in Woodbridge and Brampton and our surrounding communities, and a little less so in the inner suburbs, but you get off the subway at Black Creek, apartment towers. You get off the subway at Union Station, apartment towers. You get off the subway at, on the Danforth, apartment towers. That's now.
So talk about those surrounding areas of Toronto. Obviously, in many cases, the paving over of a lot of the landscape means that the floodwaters, they go to the next town, and often that village, town, city is the city of Toronto, right? The water rushes south, and it's Toronto that gets inundated. How do you work with, or how do you deal with the reality of a greater Toronto region? How engaged are they in these discussions?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. And we see that everywhere in the world. We have a really great asset with the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. Probably most people in this room don't know what they are because they don't tend to be in the spotlight very much. but it's a really fantastic organization that looks at the region, it like works on a watershed basis, which encompasses a lot of our neighboring municipalities and the 9 rivers that run through Toronto. And I think fundamentally, you know, all of the municipalities have a role to play. We all need to promote more green infrastructure. Every time we dig up a street, we should be thinking about replacing it with permeable pavement. We should be thinking about where we can put in basically green and blue infrastructure, because it's not just the water that runs off from other municipalities. What we're seeing more and more, like what we saw on August 7th with the cloudburst, we had a neighborhood where 120 millimeters of rain fell in a couple of hours. So it doesn't matter whether that falls in York Region or in Peel, like it fell in one neighborhood in Toronto. So we need to think about the development standards. We're forcing homeowners and new developments to retain how much water we're asking people to retain, or forcing people to retain. And then we also have to look at our own public spaces. You know, most of the city is covered by ravines or roads, and we need to think about the capacity of those systems to take in rain.
Yeah.
Well, first off, thank you, Mr. Cappell, for your words today and for visiting Seneca. A quick question about sort of the tension we face when it comes to funding the infrastructure that you talk about that could in the future position us to be a more resilient city and resilient region. You know, when you look at the provincial landscape in terms of budgets and sort of the tension points that exist, you know, even in the last 24 hours around post-secondary funding, don't have to get into specifics and recognize the sensitivities there, but rather, you know, how do we help to navigate those discussions around funding when we face the tensions that we do as you look at the difficulties we face around tax revenue and deficits?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. You know, so there are really 2 parts of climate change, right? There's climate change mitigation, which is mitigating our impact on the environment, and there's climate change adaptation, which is adapting to the changes of the environment on us. And you know, the nice thing about adaptation is that it's an investment, it's not a cost, right? You're investing, you know, maybe $150 to protect your home from a $40,000 basement flood, right? We are investing you know, $25 million to protect the Toronto waterfront from flooding based on the damage from last year. So these are investments. I think the real shame is that at some of the orders of government here, including the province, they are, you know, they're muddling those two, and they're really not, they're not making the case that investing to protect us against a hotter, wetter, and wilder climate is an investment, and they're really only focusing on the costs. And what it means is that for the people in this room who are younger, we are going to bear the costs of that malinvestment. We are going to bear the cost of the fact that the cancellation of the cap-and-trade adds $3 billion to our debt, and it also has the cost of not fighting climate change. So we're going to have to pay for that. And so I think that it's important for us, for the people who are younger in this room, to start to think about how we communicate with the older generation, how we communicate with our politicians, and try and start to change people's minds to go from cost to investment.
I'm just wondering if our colleagues in the insurance side of things, if you have any questions, observations, comments.
So my question's not related to insurance, but
Thank goodness.
before I worked at TD, I worked for Toronto Community Housing, and you talked a little bit about paying attention to vulnerable neighborhoods. There's a very large and growing backlog of repairs at Toronto Community Housing. I don't know what the number is now. I used to be able to recite it off the top of my head, but it's multiple millions and growing, and there's an aging stock of very poorly maintained high-rises filled with extremely low-income tenants, most of whom don't have renter's insurance. Is there a portion of your strategy that's looking at their needs specifically or at those buildings? Because there's a repair deficit that has to be addressed before you can start looking at everything else.
Mm-hmm. No, it's a really good point. The short answer is that we aren't looking at it, and I'll tell you why. So the scale that we're looking at, so of the 1,200 towers, 880 are owned by the private sector. So, so basically 85% are owned by the private sector, 4% are owned by social co-ops, and 11% are owned by Toronto community housing. So our view was always, if you don't get the private sector, if you don't address the concerns of the private sector, then you're never going to get to scale, right? The other factor is that this is a risk, I shouldn't say, this is an endeavor which requires a capacity for risk and investment and innovation. And I will ask you, do you think that is a capacity which exists more in the private sector or at TCH? I would agree with you. So, you know, Toronto Community Housing has a number of other issues, and they have an entire corporation that's thinking about those issues. And I think that they're doing a great job under really very complicated circumstances. They also, through the cancellation of cap and trade, lost a significant investment from the provincial government that would have addressed a large portion of that backlog of repairs. So really trying times for community housing. But we are really focused on the private sector side because we want to get to scale. And we think that once that sort of retrofit economy is up and running, the cost of doing those retrofits will come down and will be more affordable for TCH.
Great, thank you very much. Any final or questions, people? Yes?
When the power went out I guess it was about a decade ago now, and the power went out, and it was out for several days. And I remember that day because I was working in Toronto and had to get out to Whitby. And I know some people, because the power was out and transit wasn't working, some people walked 6 hours or twice that to get home or to get somewhere safe. So is there a plan for if that should happen again, or if there's any major disaster and suddenly transit's not working, how are we going to get people out? How are we going to get them home? That was a terrible heat wave as well. So if the vulnerable people, the aged, younger people, even people who have accessibility problems, you know, they're going to be too vulnerable in a situation like that, especially if it should last a week or longer. Do you have a plan, an evacuation plan for that?
So as students of emergency management in Ontario, you probably know, a lot of these things are provincially regulated. So there's a provincial plan from OFMEM, the Office of the Fire Marshal and Emergency Management. We have our own Office of Fire Services, Emergency Medical Services, and the Office of Emergency Management. They have, that's where our plans are housed for, you know, what do they call them, incident something plans. You can tell I'm not an emergency management professional. I think, you know, our contribution to that comes to the second part of what you just said, which was, you know, you listed a number of groups. You said seniors, young people, people who are you know have accessibility requirements. You know, I think our contribution to the discussion is to say, you know, you can have all the plans in the world. At the end of the day, shocks are really unpredictable, but we do know that how you fare in a shock and how you recover is fundamentally impacted by your underlying vulnerabilities. And we think that, you know, Toronto and Ontario and Canada's resilience plans should be driven by that equity focus to think about how different groups are going to be impacted by shocks. So again, what does that mean in practice? It means that we're targeting our investments at things like apartment towers, where we know we have a high risk and a high vulnerability from something like a power failure.
So how has the plan changed since this happened 10 years ago?
Yeah, I do know that those plans have changed, but again, hopefully with our report that comes at the end of the year, that there will be a next iteration.
Yeah. I think one of the things you've said, Elliott, is that all the planning in the world and all the staff in the world, without that community engagement, without the opportunity for people to help each other, which was the finding of the Hurricane Sandy, I believe, in New York, was the more resilient communities turned out to be the ones that had the higher, in effect, public, or whatever you want to call it, social capital of people who would engage with each other to help each other. That was a major finding of that that particular issue. Yeah. Any final questions, comments, observations, brilliant words of insight that anybody would like to contribute to this discussion at this time? Oh, sure, Tim.
Just a kind of a personal note. Here, when we had our ice storm here, just what, 3 years ago now, roughly. Somewhere in there.
2013, end of 2013.
Well, it was 2013. Yeah, it's kind of faded from memory. that was kind of the first time when I realized I wasn't prepared myself. And along that time, the Canadian government had come out with a 72-hour kit list. And we found ourselves not able, with the power being out for 4 days, simple things like cooking and keeping the lights on and keeping warm. Anybody else have those experiences at all? Yeah? So as a result of that, in our own family unit, we said, okay, we're going to get our 72-hour kit. So I don't know, did anyone else go out and start putting away a bit of water and a little bit of food and stuff like that? More than the craft dinner normally? Okay. So, you know, is there any movement within city government to expand on this whole idea of, for instance, backflow preventers? Is there a program for getting an awareness out for homeowners, or at the opposite end, a 72-hour kit for preparing yourself? What sort of incentives are there out there?
I have a 72-hour kit.
Yeehaw!
Mine includes a very large bottle of whiskey, because I figure if the power's out for 3 days, I'm going to get bloody bored also. So we've done two things. One, I think, is going to be spoken about a bit later today, so I don't want to go into it in great detail. It's called the Home Resilience Pilot. What we did is that we subsidized 200 homes to do basically a 65-point checklist around the house, primarily focused on flooding and emergency management. So one of the questions was, do you have a 72-hour kit? Do you have a plan for 72 hours? And we're using that data to inform the city's resilience strategy, and I believe it is also going into some work here at Seneca College. I don't want to go into that in detail because I think it's going to be picked up by other people. And then the other thing which we are going to propose, or we are likely to propose in the resilience strategy, is a change in the approach to emergency management to focus on a community resilience approach, which is to say that, like, I agree with you, a 72-hour kit's essential, but there are a lot of families in this city who, you know, really struggle to make it to the end of the week or the end of the month, and the idea of having 72 hours extra supplies is simply not available to them. And fundamentally, those, I mean, you gave the bright side of the picture that neighborhoods with higher social capital do better. We know that racialized neighborhoods and lower income neighborhoods did worse, right? And so we really need to think about lower income neighborhoods as a key focus for vulnerability. And we need to think about, okay, some homeowners, those who are able to have those kits, we need to get out there and we need to get the message out. We need to change the mindset. And for communities and homeowners and renters and new Canadians who maybe for whom our communication is not accessible, right? We need to work through community groups to get that message out and think about what community structures we can put in place.
Well, Elliott Cappell, Chief Resilience Officer of the City of Toronto, thank you very much.
Thank you.